The Moetti mansion stood atop a hill overlooking the city, a silent giant of grey stone and shadowed windows. Inside, the silence was even deeper, a heavy blanket that smothered the grand hallways and spacious rooms. This was the home of Rico Moetti, a man whose name was spoken in whispers across the city, a man who commanded fear and respect with a single look. But within these walls, his power meant nothing. Here, he was not a boss, he was a father, and his world was broken. 6 months had passed since the illness had stolen his wife, and in that time, the light had vanished from his daughter's eyes. Tessa, a little girl of just 6 years old, had retreated into a quiet world of her own. She no longer raced through the halls with her dolls. She no longer sang silly songs. Her laughter, which once used to bounce off the marble floors like music, was now just a ghostly memory. She spent her days in the large drawing room, curled up in a chair too big for her, staring out at the gardens without really seeing them. Rico would watch her from the doorway, his own heart aching with a pain no amount of power could fix. He would have given all his wealth, all his influence, just to see her smile again. Tonight was like every other night. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the seconds, each one a reminder of the emptiness. Rico knelt before Tessa's chair, his large, usually commanding hands gently holding her small ones. "Tesoro mio," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You must eat something. Please." Tessa simply shook her head, her gaze fixed on some distant point outside the window. A desperate idea, a wild attempt to spark any reaction, formed in his mind. "Perhaps," he said, forcing a lightness he didn't feel, "we need a change. Maybe I should find you a new mom." The words felt strange and hollow leaving his mouth, a betrayal of a memory he still cherished. Tessa gave no response, but a single tear traced a path down her cheek. That was enough for Rico. He stood up, his decision made. "We are going out," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument, even though he was only arguing with the silence. His bodyguards drove them down the hill, away from the oppressive mansion and into the lively, glowing heart of the city. Rico bypassed the fancy, expensive restaurants he usually frequented. He was looking for something different, something warm. He finally spotted a small, cozy-looking place tucked between two larger buildings. A cheerful sign above the door read "The Sunlit Corner," and through the window, he could see checkered tablecloths and the soft glow of lanterns. It looked nothing like his world, and that was precisely why he chose it. A little bell chimed as they stepped inside. The air was filled with the delicious smells of garlic, baking bread, and herbs. The place was humming with the quiet chatter of other families, a sound so foreign and pleasant it made Rico's chest feel tight. They were shown to a small table in the corner, and Tessa slid into her chair, her head bowed, looking as small and out of place as a lost sparrow. A menu was placed in front of them, but Tessa didn't even look at it. Rico tried to point out the different pastas, the colorful desserts, but her only response was a slight shrug. He felt his hope beginning to fade again, the heavy weight of failure settling back onto his shoulders. Then, a voice, soft and clear like a bell, cut through his thoughts. "Hello there, welcome to the Sunlit Corner." Rico looked up and found himself staring into the warmest, kindest brown eyes he had ever seen. They belonged to their waitress, a young woman named Nora Velan. Her hair was tied back loosely, and she had a smudge of flour on her cheek. She smiled, a genuine, easy smile that seemed to light up the entire space around their table. She didn't look at Rico with the fear or caution he was used to seeing in people's eyes. She simply saw a man and his daughter. She placed her attention entirely on Tessa. Instead of leaning over her, she gracefully knelt down beside the table, bringing herself to the little girl's eye level. "My name is Nora," she said, her voice a gentle hum. "I think you might be the most important guest we've had all night." Tessa didn't look up, but Rico saw her tiny fingers curl slightly on the tablecloth. Nora wasn't discouraged. "You know," she continued conspiratorially, "the chef told me a secret. He made a very special tiramisu tonight, but he thinks it's missing something. I told him it probably needs an extra river of chocolate sauce. What do you think? Should we test it for him?" There was a long, silent moment. Rico held his breath. Then, ever so slowly, Tessa lifted her head. Her big, sad eyes met Nora's warm ones. And then, a miracle happened. The corners of Tessa's mouth trembled, and then they lifted, forming a tiny, shy, but utterly real smile. It was a little wobbly, but it was there. It was the most beautiful thing Rico had seen in 6 months. His own breath caught in his throat, and he felt an unexpected sting in his eyes. He looked from his daughter's smiling face to Nora's beaming one, and a strange, powerful feeling, a mix of overwhelming gratitude and something else he couldn't name, flooded through him. As Nora stood to take their order, Rico, wanting to hold on to this magical moment, leaned close to Tessa. The joke from the mansion, now feeling less like a joke and more like a desperate wish, tumbled out. "See, Piccolina? Maybe I should find a nice lady like her to be your new mom." He said it lightly, a smile on his face, meant only for Tessa's ears. But the universe had other plans. Nora had turned back for a moment to confirm their drink order. At that exact second, Tessa, her eyes shining with a sudden, certain light, pointed her small finger directly at Nora. Her voice, clear and loud enough to be heard at the nearby tables, rang out. "I already did. I choose her." Time seemed to stop. The gentle clatter of cutlery and the soft murmur of conversations faded into a dull roar in Rico's ears. He stared at his daughter, completely stunned. His cheeks grew warm with a flush of sheer astonishment and embarrassment. He slowly, nervously, dragged his gaze from Tessa to Nora, terrified of what her reaction would be. Nora was frozen, the order pad clutched tightly in her hand. A deep, rosy blush spread from her neck all the way up to her cheeks. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She should have felt awkward, or maybe even offended by the strange comment from a customer. But as her eyes met Rico's, seeing not a fearsome mafia boss, but a shocked, vulnerable, and incredibly handsome man, she didn't feel any of those things. Instead, she felt a dizzying, inexplicable pull, a connection that snapped into place as suddenly and surely as Tessa's pointing finger. She was caught in the intensity of his gaze, a man clearly as lost as his little girl. Managing to find her breath, Nora did not scold or retreat. She simply looked down at Tessa, her warm smile returning, softer now, and filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. She reached out and gently patted Tessa's head. "That," she said, her voice a little shaky but kind, "is the sweetest thing anyone has ever said to me." Then, without another word, she turned and walked back towards the kitchen, her mind spinning and her heart felt strange. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal sounds, but for Rico, Tessa, and Nora, the world had just tilted, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that had returned to the Moetti mansion in the days following the dinner at the sunlit corner was of a different quality than before. It was no longer a heavy, accepted blanket of grief, but a restless, waiting quiet, filled with the echoing memory of a single, shy smile and the ringing declaration of a child's choice. Rico Moetti found himself pacing the long, polished floors of his study, his usual focus on business ledgers and territorial disputes completely shattered. His mind's eye held only two images, playing over and over: the radiant warmth of Nora's smile as she knelt before his daughter, and the startling, profound certainty in Tessa's voice when she had pointed and chosen. The memory of that moment sent an unfamiliar and unsettling tremor through his carefully controlled world. Tessa, for her part, had retreated back into her shell, but a small crack had been left open. She did not speak of the waitress, but Rico would sometimes catch her staring at the door, as if expecting someone to walk through it. She had started drawing again, her crayons moving over paper with a purpose they had lacked for months. One drawing, left on the breakfast table, depicted 3 stick figures, a large one, a small one, and one in the middle with a smiling circle for a face and a scribble of yellow for hair. Rico had stared at that drawing for a long time, a lump forming in his throat. The simple, childish artwork was a plea, a hope put to paper, and it struck him with more force than any business rival's threat ever could. He knew he had to act. The impulse was reckless, born of emotion rather than cold logic, which was a dangerous thing for a man in his position. But the sight of his daughter's smile, however brief, had become a prize more valuable than any other. He summoned his most trusted advisor, an older man named Silas who had been with the family for decades. He dictated a short, formal letter of invitation, requesting the presence of Miss Nora Velan for a private dinner at the Moetti residence to express his personal gratitude for her kindness to his daughter. He instructed Silas to have it delivered by hand, with no mention of his professional reputation. Silas had raised a skeptical eyebrow but had said nothing, simply bowing his head and departing to carry out the unusual order. Meanwhile, life for Nora Velan had returned to its normal rhythm of double shifts, tired feet, and counting tips. Yet, her world too had been subtly altered. The memory of the intense, handsome man with the sad eyes and his heartbreakingly quiet daughter lingered at the edges of her thoughts during quiet moments. She found herself replaying the little girl's words, "I choose her," feeling a confusing mix of fluttering warmth and bewildering disbelief. It was a scene from a fairy tale, utterly disconnected from her reality of rent payments and worn-out shoes. She had convinced herself it was a strange, one-time encounter, a fleeting moment of magic in a mundane life, and she tried to put it out of her mind. The delivery of the letter, therefore, felt like a lightning strike in her small, orderly world. A severe-looking man in an impeccably tailored suit appeared at the staff entrance of the restaurant, asking for her by name. He presented her with a thick, cream-colored envelope. Her name was written on the front in a strong, elegant script. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal, a real wax seal, and read the brief message inside. An invitation to dinner. At his home. The paper felt heavy and expensive, and the formality of it was both intimidating and incredibly alluring. Her co-workers buzzed with curiosity and concern, warning her about powerful men and their strange whims. But Nora's thoughts flew not to the feared Rico Moetti, but to the little girl, Tessa, and her silent, sad eyes. After a day of anxious deliberation, her own kind heart overruling her sensible fears, she penned a simple, accepting reply. The car that came to collect her on the appointed evening was long, black, and silent. The drive up the winding hill to the mansion was a journey into another universe, one of towering iron gates and sprawling, manicured grounds that seemed to go on forever. When the car stopped before the immense front door, Nora felt a wave of pure intimidation. This was not just a house, it was a fortress, a monument to a life of power and isolation. The door was opened not by Rico, but by the same severe man, Silas, who greeted her with a polite but distant nod and ushered her inside. The interior was even more overwhelming. Vast, high-ceilinged rooms were filled with expensive, dark furniture and art that looked like it belonged in a museum. But it was cold. Eerily cold. The air itself felt still and unused, as if the very walls were holding their breath. It was the quietest place Nora had ever been, a silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. Then, a small figure appeared at the top of a grand, curving staircase. Tessa, wearing a simple but beautiful blue dress, was peering down through the banisters. When she saw Nora, her entire face transformed. The shy smile from the restaurant returned, wider and more sure this time, and she hurried down the steps, her small shoes tapping softly on the marble. Rico appeared from a doorway then, and the sight of him in his own home, outside the context of the restaurant, made Nora's breath catch. He was dressed more casually in dark trousers and a simple, well-fitting sweater, but it only seemed to emphasize his powerful build and the quiet authority he carried. He looked less like a storybook mafia boss and more like a man, a very handsome and slightly nervous one. "Miss Velan," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble that seemed to be the only real thing in the cavernous hall. "Thank you for coming. Tessa has been waiting." Dinner was a quiet, formal affair in a dining room large enough to seat 50, served by staff who moved like ghosts. The food was exquisite, but the conversation was stilted, filled with polite questions about her work and her family. Rico was a difficult man to read, his expressions guarded, his answers brief. Nora began to feel she had made a mistake, that the magic of the restaurant had been an illusion. The true thaw began after the meal, when Rico, seemingly grasping for a reason to make her stay, asked if she would mind reading to Tessa before she left. Tessa immediately slipped her small hand into Nora's, a gesture of such innate trust it melted Nora's lingering anxiety. They retired to the library, a room with walls of leather-bound books and a large, comfortable sofa. Tessa curled up against Nora's side as she began to read from a book of fairy tales. As Nora's voice filled the room, giving life to princes and dragons, Rico stood in the doorway, unseen, and watched. He watched the way Nora's finger traced the words on the page for Tessa to follow. He watched the way Tessa's body relaxed completely against her, her head resting on Nora's arm, her eyes wide with engagement. He saw his daughter, for the first time in half a year, look not just peaceful, but genuinely interested in the world again. The hard, frozen parts of his own heart began to crack and shift. When the story was finished and Tessa was reluctantly put to bed, Nora prepared to leave. Rico walked her to the grand foyer, the silence between them now different, charged with unspoken thoughts. "You have a gift with her," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it all evening. "She hasn't let anyone read to her since," he trailed off, the sentence unfinished, but the meaning hung clearly in the air between them. "She's a wonderful girl," Nora replied, looking up at him, her brown eyes sincere in the dim light. "She just needs to remember how to be one." He looked down at her, truly looking at her, not as a waitress or a curiosity, but as Nora. He saw the kindness in her eyes, the strength in her posture, the warmth that seemed to radiate from her and challenge the coldness of his home. On an impulse he did not fully understand, he reached out and gently took her hand. His own hand was large and strong, his skin slightly rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. The contact was electric, a sudden, shocking jolt of heat that traveled straight up Nora's arm and settled in her chest, making her heart hammer. She did not pull away. "The library," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze intense and focused solely on her. "There are many more books. Tessa would. I would be, if you would consider staying for a while longer." It was not the command of a boss, but the hesitant, hopeful request of a man who was seeing a flicker of light after a very long darkness. And in that moment, with her hand still in his, Nora could not imagine saying anything but yes. The following weeks settled into a new, fragile rhythm for the great, silent mansion on the hill. Nora's presence, initially a formal visit, became a regular and eagerly anticipated occurrence. She did not come every day, for she still maintained her own life and her work at the restaurant, but her arrivals were like sunbeams breaking through stained glass, casting colored warmth onto the cold marble floors. The staff, who had for so long moved like silent shadows, began to exchange quiet, hopeful glances. The air itself seemed lighter, easier to breathe. The change was most profoundly visible in the smallest resident. Tessa began to bloom like a flower finally receiving sunlight. Her drawings, once stark and lonely, now buzzed with color, depicting three figures holding hands in gardens, under rainbows, and in front of a house that no longer looked like a fortress, but a home. Her laughter, a sound once thought lost forever, now occasionally echoed down the hallways, a sound more precious to Rico than any symphony. Rico found his own carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, brick by emotional brick. His conversations with Nora evolved from polite thank yous into long, meandering talks in the library after Tessa was asleep. He discovered she was not just kind, but sharp-witted and surprisingly stubborn, unafraid to challenge his opinions or make him see a different point of view. She asked him about his childhood, his dreams, things no one had dared to ask in years. In turn, he learned about her life, her struggles, her simple, fierce dream of one day owning her own little cafe. He found himself captivated not by a fantasy, but by the real, resilient woman before him. The professional mask he wore for the outside world began to slip in her presence. The feared Rico Moetti would sit, mesmerized, simply watching her animated face as she spoke, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the gentle curve of her smile. The turning point, the moment the careful dance of friendship shattered into something deeper and more urgent, happened on a balmy evening on the mansion's vast terrace. The city lights twinkled far below like a carpet of fallen stars. They were standing by the stone railing, close enough that the sleeve of Nora's dress brushed against his arm, sending a current of awareness through him. They had been talking about nothing of consequence, and a comfortable silence had fallen between them. Rico turned to look at her, the moonlight silvering her features, and found he could no longer fight the pull he felt. It was a force stronger than his will, more powerful than his past. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. Her eyes widened, but she did not pull away. She simply leaned into his touch, a soft sigh escaping her lips. He bent his head, slowly, giving her every chance to refuse, and then his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle or hesitant. It was a dam breaking. It was months of loneliness, of grief, of a slow, burning hope finally igniting. It was a confession without words, a promise and a plea all at once. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her firmly against him, and she responded with a passion that matched his own, her hands sliding up to tangle in the hair at the nape of his neck. The world outside, the city, his business, his reputation, ceased to exist. There was only her warmth, her taste, the feel of her heart beating against his chest. It was a kiss that sealed a new, unbreakable bond between them, a silent vow that something profound had irrevocably changed. For a few blissful days, they existed in a private, glowing bubble. The mansion was not just a house with laughter in it. It was now a home filled with stolen touches, lingering glances, and the quiet, profound intimacy of two people discovering they are no longer alone in the world. Rico felt a peace he had never known, a sense of rightness that settled deep in his soul. But the world he had built for himself was a dangerous one, and it did not take long for it to intrude. Whispers, as they always do, began to circulate. Rico Moetti has a new woman. He's replaced his wife. The words were distorted and cruel by the time they reached the public market where Nora sometimes shopped. She overheard two women gossiping, their voices laced with a nasty curiosity. "That waitress from the little restaurant," one sneered. "Can you imagine? Thinking she could belong in that world. She's just a passing fancy for a man like him. She doesn't belong there." The words struck Nora like physical blows. The glowing bubble of her happiness popped, and the cold, harsh reality came rushing in. The fear she had suppressed now rose up, choking her. They were right. What was she doing? She was a waitress, a simple woman from a simple life, trying to fit into a world of mansions, bodyguards, and whispered dangers. The memory of Rico's kiss was suddenly overshadowed by the terrifying image of his world, a world of shadows and violence she could never truly understand. The thought of getting hurt, or worse, of Tessa being hurt because of her presence, was unbearable. Believing it was the right thing, the only safe thing for everyone, she made the most painful decision of her life. She stopped answering his calls. She did not return to the mansion. The silence that returned to the Moetti home was the most devastating of all. It was not the old silence of grief, it was a fresh, agonizing silence of loss and confusion. Tessa cried quietly in her room, the drawings of 3 happy figures now crumpled in a corner. Rico was a storm of contained fury and despair. He threw himself into his work, his face returning to its old, cold mask, but it was no use. The mansion felt like a tomb again, and he was merely a ghost haunting it. After 3 days of this agony, he could bear it no longer. He had spent his life commanding situations, but this was a situation his commands could not fix. This required something far more vulnerable. He found her leaving her small apartment, her face pale and tired. She looked up, startled and then heartbroken to see him. "Rico, please," she began, her voice trembling. This can't work. I heard what people are saying. I don't belong in your world. It's too dangerous. I'm too ordinary." He didn't try to command her. He didn't get angry. He simply stood before her, all his power and prestige stripped away, leaving just a man, begging for his heart. "Nora," he said, his voice so deep and soft it seemed to vibrate in the space between them. "I have spent my entire life giving orders. Everyone obeys. But you." He took a step closer, his eyes holding hers with a raw, open intensity. "You are the only one I can't command. My heart doesn't listen to my head when it comes to you. It only knows that without you, the silence is going to kill me." He opened his arms, a simple, vulnerable gesture. It was all the invitation she needed. With a choked sob, she ran into them, and he caught her, holding her so tightly it felt as if he were trying to merge their 2 souls into one. This embrace was different from all the others. It was a claiming and a surrender. It was filled with the passion of their kiss and the desperation of their days apart. He buried his face in her hair, whispering promises against her skin, promises of protection, of love, of a future where she would never have to doubt her place again. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered, her tears soaking into his shirt. "My home is with you." Later, back in the mansion, Tessa, who had been watching from the top of the stairs, giggled with pure, unbridled joy. She raced down and wrapped her small arms around both their legs, creating a tangled, perfect knot of 3. The feared Mafia boss, the kind-hearted waitress, and the little girl who had chosen her own family. The world outside, with all its dangers and whispers, no longer mattered. They had forged a new family, not by blood, but by a heart that had stubbornly, defiantly, refused to let go. This story of a lonely heart finding its way home is just the beginning. The world is full of untold tales where love triumphs over the darkest of pasts. If you wish to be swept away by more stories where courage meets kindness and passion defies all odds, where simple moments become extraordinary memories, then join us on this journey. Subscribe now, and never miss a story that will make your heart believe in love again.